Well, welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the battle for the Syrian city of Aleppo and the diplomatic efforts to end airstrikes in the besieged city. Let's get back to our panel right now. Let's go to Alexander. Alexander, the ceasefire, as we know, has broken down. Then the United States announced that it had suspended talks with the United States. And to complicate matters even further, Western nations have been accusing Russia of committing war crimes. In fact, President Putin cancelled a trip to France after the French said that he should be investigated for war crimes. Let's watch what Secretary of State John Kerry, the U.S. Secretary of State, had to say.
These are acts that beg for an appropriate investigation of war crimes. And those who commit these would and should be held accountable for these actions. They're beyond the accidental now, way beyond, years beyond the accidental. This is a targeted strategy to terrorize civilians and to kill anybody and everybody who is in the way of their military objectives.
So on the one hand, Alexander, we're hearing here that Russia could be committing war crimes. On the other hand, the United States wants to cooperate with Russia in seeking a solution to this.
Well, first of all, about war crimes. If anyone is guilty of war crimes in this century, that would be America, unfortunately. So for them to blame Russia for war crimes is just, surreal. Secondly, the ceasefire was broken by the Americans. They bombed Syrian positions. They did it on purpose. It was now proven. They made up that provocation with the UN convoy. It has been filmed. It is known that the terrorists on the ground, and by the way, Putin today confirmed it again, that it was the terrorist groups that destroyed that convoy. And the Americans just needed a pretext to say that the Russians didn't abide by the ceasefire. So this talk by John Kerry, this is just not serious. And I can tell you the worry in Moscow is that there is a political vacuum now in Washington, and nobody really knows who does what and who decides what. We have the Pentagon supporting one side of the conflict, the CIA supporting another side. We have strange people dictating their will to the State Department and the government in Washington. It is very, very difficult. And again, by the way, Putin today said the problem with dealing with the Americans is that you don't know what to expect from them. They do not do it by diplomacy, they do it by blackmail mostly, or by making strange demands. This is why it is so difficult for Russia to negotiate about Syria with America.
Lots to unpack there, David.
Well, look, I've been critical of U.S. policy, but this statement is reprehensible. I mean, let's talk about assassination of journalists. We just had the mention by Mohammed Ghanem of Grozny rules, and also we can go back to 1982 and look at Hamar rules. There's precedent for this in terms of destruction of an entire city. Right. That comment was sheer deflection. I mean, the way Russia has waged war in places like Syria, places like Chechnya has done nothing but exacerbate the problem. Now, I fully believe that we've already heard from you, sir.
What you're saying is preposterous.
Look, we've already heard from you. What you've said is preposterous.
But you can't just lie. You can't just lie over the television. You say lies.
Lying over the television is what you're doing.
And then expect me to sit here and expect you to lie against Russia. You are bluffing.
Did you not?
You are lying.
Did you not demolish Grozny? Did Russia not demolish Grozny?
Okay.
In
Alexander,
Libya,
I will get to you in a moment.
You have been killing civilians all over the world, and you dare to talk about Russian war crimes in Chechnya. Chechnya is part of Russia.
Sir, all right, I've got to let David speak here. Go ahead.
This heated, overbearing response.
Despicable behavior. Despicable.
Okay, one moment. Go ahead.
I mean,
despicable.
That was all noise and no substance. All noise and no substance. We can see what is being done on the ground in Syria.
I want to get back.
Look, at the end of the day, I think that there is no option but a negotiated settlement. I don't think that Assad's going to fall.
On that very point about a negotiated settlement, let's listen to President Assad and what he said. Let's watch.
Continue the fight with the rebels till they leave Aleppo. They have to. There's no other options. We won't accept that terrorists will take control of any part of Syria, not only Aleppo. This is our mission.
Assad's position has always been that Syria is in a fight against terrorists. And if you listen to that, he believes that there is a military solution to this.
He's been in a fight against people who've been in an uprising against the regime. Right. And if you look at early on the Syrian strategy, it has disproportionately focused on moderate rebel groups. In part, it's a strategy to make the opposition seem as unattractive as possible by killing off those groups in the first instance who the international community would want to support or would want to back. At the end of the day, look, the Nusra Front has been mentioned multiple times. You can look at my writings. I've consistently said that this group is an enormous problem. They've rebranded themselves as Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, but the break from al-Qaeda has not been genuine in any way, shape, or form. This is a problem. It's a problem of many states' makings, but not the least of which being Syria and also Russia.
Okay, Mohammed, let's look at the Syrian position. What is the position of the Syrian government? Does it believe that there can be a negotiated settlement here, or does it believe that it can actually win this war?
Assad has made it very clear, and Assad's minister Walid Muallim has made it very clear. Their objective, they said, and I'm paraphrasing here, their objective is to win a military war. That's what they said. In as many words. So that's what they're after. Yeah. That's number one. Number two, also to the point that your guest brought up, if there are, let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, hypothetically, that there's no moderate opposition. So who was Russia trying to work out a ceasefire with? They were trying to work out a ceasefire with Al-Qaeda? I thought they were, I thought that Putin himself said, called them, and Lavrov too, called them moderate opposition. So if there's no moderate opposition, who was Russia trying to strike a ceasefire deal with? This is very self-contradictory. North of Aleppo today, the Syrian opposition, the moderate opposition, captured at least 5 villages from ISIS. So there are ongoing operations, even though we have to deal and fend off this onslaught by Russia and the Assad regime. We're going after ISIS, and we've captured, with support from Turkey, about 5 villages from them. What is the Assad regime doing there today to fight ISIS? Nothing. The Assad regime is bombing civilians in Aleppo. This is what the Assad regime is interested in.
Right. Let me get Alexander's view on this. Alexander, by agreeing with the Russians, by the US agreeing with the Russians to go against ISIL, do you believe that the Americans have effectively given up their hope that Assad could be removed from power?
Well, first of all, the point about Assad is that if he wouldn't have had any support, like some of your guests say, in the country, he would not have lasted 5 years during a most fiercest war we have ever seen in the Middle East. So that's one point. Second point, Russia has been claiming all along that we don't want another Libya. When you remove a government and there is a vacuum, it is filled by jihadists. It happened in Libya, it happened in Iraq, and this is a very strong point that Russia is making. Thirdly, Russia is not saying that everybody on the side of the rebels are Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra. And there are obviously people there who are different from these terrorists. But the problem is that all of these rebels use this tactic of hiding between civilians in residential buildings, and that is why the collateral damage was so high. It's their tactics of fighting the war with the Syrian army that brings on these casualties. You can't sit in a residential building and expect that nobody will die. And that's what they're doing, unlike the Syrian army, which do not hide among civilians. That's the big difference between the two sides fighting. And all this talk about somebody targeting specifically civilians in Aleppo is madness, because no government in any country will kill its civilians, giving more popularity to the rebels. It is obscene.
Okay, let me get the final word from Mohammed Ali in Damascus. What's the view from Damascus, Mohammed? Is this going to be a war to the bitter end, or could you see the Assad government come to the negotiating table and negotiate some kind of power-sharing deal?
Well, let's remind you and remind your viewers that the Syrian government's policy since the start of the unrest was based on 2 points. First, fighting terrorism, and second, reaching a political solution. But however, there is no chance for a success of any kind of political solution without fighting terrorism. And terrorism, of course, here is ISIL and Al-Nusra Front and any group that fights with them. And finally, we have to point out, even in the view of humanitarian organizations like the Human Rights Watch. The Human Rights Watch in 2014 on June 22nd said that armed groups send children into battle, including the so-called FSA groups. In addition to that, there are reports in March, there's a report on March 20, 2012 by the Human Rights Watch that armed opposition groups are committing crimes like kidnapping civilians and torture. And all of those crimes are actually carried out also by the ISIL and Al-Nusra Front, which makes, at the end of the day, no difference between those so-called moderates and the others that are extremists. So definitely those are terrorists, and according to the Syrian government, they should be fought in order to give a chance to any kind of political solution for at least those few armed men who are Syrians, who are actually willing to take part in political and peaceful talks.
Assad is not fighting ISIS. Assad is empowering ISIS through lucrative oil deals. Assad is purchasing oil from ISIS. The Syrian people and the Syrian rebels are going after ISIS. I would really love to see the Assad regime going after ISIS, but this hasn't happened yet.